we'll give it a minute here for some attendees to gather, and then we'll get started. While people are joining, I'll just say good morning to everyone, and thank you for logging on to join us here. This is a Zoom conference put on by Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and it's called The Green New Deal, What's Next? And here's how this came about. Last year, in March of 2020, in the spring issue of Democracy Journal, we published a symposium on the Green New Deal, partly at the behest of one of our panelists, Tom Perriello. And we put together what we thought was a great group of writers and activists to write a range of pieces about how to push this idea forward. And we hit publish and we posted it to our website, and we were all very excited. And that was March 11th of 2020. So the world was about to change in all the ways with which we're now all too familiar. So the event that we had planned then, which we hoped would be that summer and in person and large, obviously got put off. And now here it is, right now, finally happening. And I'm very grateful to our panelists for participating. So I am just going to say hello and introduce the panelists and introduce our moderator, and then turn it over to her and disappear. And I'll leave it to them to engage in a great, robust conversation. I don't think this discussion needs to lean back too much to what the people wrote, since that was so long ago. But obviously, if you want to reference what you wrote and you find it relevant to do so, of course, do that. So I'll start by introducing the panelist who isn't here yet, but who, oh, there it is. There she is. We just got a message. Rhiana is trying to join, and give me just a minute to send her the correct link.
She's on, but not in the panelist section, so.
Yeah, this will just take a second. Okay, she should be into us soon. I'll start by talking about Rhiana. I'm sure everybody here knows that Rhiana Gunn-Wright worked with AOC on the original formulation of the Green New Deal. And she is now the climate policy director at the Roosevelt Institute, where she does great things. She wrote in the Democracy Journal Symposium, co-wrote with Bracken Hendricks and Sam Ricketts, a piece that was called The Greatest Mobilization Since World War II, which made the case for how a potential Democratic administration, which is now reality, could mobilize. There she is. Hi, Rhiana. Could mobilize the country and the government, the executive branch, for broad action on this front. So welcome, Rhiana. Tom Perriello is the executive director of Open Society Foundations and United States programs. He, of course, is a former member of Congress, also from the Charlottesville, Virginia area. His piece in the journal was A New American Dream for All, and that was it's mostly about like what he thought the legislative strategy should be on these issues if there was a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress, which there are. So I guess we'll hear from him whether it's measuring up to what he envisioned. Maurice Mitchell is the national director of the Working Families Party, and he's a longtime organizer. And he wrote Building the Green New Deal Movement. So whereas Rhiana wrote a piece that was mostly directed at what the executive branch should do, and Tom's piece was mostly directed at the legislative branch, Maurice's piece more described the grassroots activism that would be needed to create the room for and sustain enthusiasm for a Green New Deal. So it'll be interesting to hear from him on how that's coming along. Then finally, our last panelist was not a contributor, but we think no less of him for that. And we're pleased to welcome Paul Mejia of the Sunrise Movement. He's a national spokesperson and a hub coordinator. And he's here because Varshini Prakash of Sunrise, whom I'm sure you all know, did contribute to the symposium. And she and Jay Inslee co-wrote the overview piece. And Varshini couldn't join us today, but we're very grateful to Paul for stepping in. And with that, I will toss it to our terrific moderator, Kate Aronoff of the New Republic, who is, as you all know, one of the most knowledgeable and astute journalists covering these issues from a progressive perspective. And I just say thank you to everyone. And Kate, it's all yours.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael, and good to be here with everyone. And I have not talked about something that happened before the pandemic in a long time. So most of the conversation will not be on the issue itself, as Michael said, but sort of asking to think about the moment we're in, which is an extraordinarily busy one this week for Green New Deal policy in particular. So the timing is pretty good. So, I just sort of want to start off there, excuse me, and sort of ask each of you, to talk about how, the sort of innumerable events of the last year, a pandemic, uprisings for racial justice across this country, Joe Biden's election, white supremacist attack on the Capitol, of $1.9 trillion stimulus, how that has sort of changed, if it has, sort of your understanding of what getting to a Green New Deal should look like, what a Green New Deal itself should look like, and how to get there. So I guess to start off, maybe we can start with Maurice. I'll sort of go across the screen as I see it.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. And it's really great to be with Tom and Paul and Rhiana. So looking at the events of the past year, both the political events and culturally how we've shifted through the uprisings. I mean, it's interesting how all of these events, I think, have conspired to create an opening for us. So I remember more than a year ago thinking, okay, we need to defeat Donald Trump, which, defeating a sitting president, an incumbent president, is just historically has been vexing, right? But we need to do that. That's job number one. Then we need to flip the Senate, and the path to do that was not a given at all. But we must do that. So simply defeating Donald Trump, but then not having governing power wasn't going to cut it. And then we needed to convince the Democrats, who have not shown up as being, triumphant people's warriors every time they had a chance to govern. We need to convince them to do things that they've never done at a scale that they've never done. And all of those things have to agree with one another. And we need to put everything we have on that. And so I put it at like 5% that we would actually be able to do those things, but it was a 5% worth doing because of the stakes. And here we are on the other side of the new year, and all of those things have lined up. I don't think anybody, when Joe Biden entered the primary, would have thought that he would have been the president that would have delivered $1.9 trillion directly to communities, none of that money going to corporations or the wealthy in relief, and that we would be even talking in the trillions of dollars, right? And so, of course, there's a lot to say about the scale of the recent package that the president laid out, and I think probably everybody on this call agrees that we need to go bigger. But the fact that the president is using the frameworks and language, and his administration is using the frameworks and language that came from the ground and came from advocates, I think is a testament to the organizing. And to me, the cultural shift on the ground. There was a mass movement that included a lot of folks, that was multiracial, that was in every single region of the country, that was catalyzed by through the movement for Black Lives and the sort of people's response to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But that mass movement was a cross-sector, multiracial mass movement that desired a lot more than simply justice in those cases. And that mass movement is, to me, part of the electoral success in Georgia, as well as in November, and to me, part of what could be our governing successes. And so that is what gives me hope for the possibility over the next decade to make this decade the decade of the Green New Deal.
Great, thank you so much. And just a quick housekeeping note before we move on to the first sort of opening. There is a Q&A section at the bottom. So if you want to put questions in there, we'll try to get to a couple of those at the end. So next up on my screen would be John Paul.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I hear so much truth and so much power behind what Maurice just said, right? Movements have laid the groundwork for everything that's being taken on now. And I think the spiraling crises that we've been in the midst of for the past year, you know, people kind of woke up to the fact that all of this stuff didn't just happen out of the blue, but all of these crises that we were engulfed in were rather symptoms of a normal that was unsustainable since the dawn of when it was created. We saw at the onset of the pandemic that private healthcare system designed around profit left millions of people out during a pandemic. Like what? And it left out mostly poor, working class, and people of color. We saw that, you know, while folks were struggling to make ends meet in the time of this health crisis, you know, big titans of industry were feigning sympathy for the plights of essential workers, but at the same time asked us to go back into the factories, back into the workplaces, and work the same shitty jobs for the same low wages. And I think that loads of the American public have woken up to the fact that the systems that we have accepted as legitimate and the normal that we have accepted as legitimate for so long is unsustainable, not only for our planet, but for our livelihoods. And like Maurice said, it gives us an opening, right? It gives us an opportunity to challenge the way that normal has governed for so long, and instead build systems that actually work for us because we can create them. And that's what the Green New Deal means to me, right? It means not the ambitious agenda of a few political folks over in Washington, but a popular mandate that has found its way to the mouths of allies in Congress that are ushering this as the popular mandate of the 21st century that we have to pursue. And loads of stuff has changed. I know from an organizing perspective over at Sunrise Movement, our movement has had to get really creative about how we organize. What does it mean to not have masses of people on the streets, but small targeted actions? And what does it mean to look to our neighbors and supply people with resources in times of crisis, and use that opportunity and use that solidarity to imagine together an alternative future of what could be. And the first step to get there is fighting for a Green New Deal. So I think that's the major shift that has happened over the course of the past year. And as much pain and as much crisis as it has brought, it has also broken down the barriers of how we've shifted public opinion more towards our side.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Look, you know, when I was younger, I basically felt like movements changed the world and politicians showed up to cut the ribbon. And now I think it's a little bit more of a partnership where movements change our sense of what's possible. And politicians have to work within the sense of what's possible. And real change happens, and you know, the classic is the LBJ MLK moment, is where you have a politician that's willing to take a bold sense of what's possible, go on the outer limb of that, and you have movements strong enough to have changed the sense of the possible in the way that moments like Selma did. And I don't think there's any question that the last 2 years, as Maurice said, we have seen movements radically change and expand our sense of what's possible on climate, on jobs, on a care economy, on immigration, on racial justice, on criminal justice reform. And much to the surprise of many of us, a politician who has, if I may say, zero, what's left to give, and seems to want to do big, bold things, and is not starting with the question, okay, what can get through the Senate, but at least starting with the question, what solves the problem? And then we can work within the political realities, which remain very real, the political limitations. And that's why we have movements continuing. The 1990s or even the aught-year definition possible. And I do think it's useful to contrast this moment. Last time there was a serious push on climate legislation and see how much has changed. For one thing that I think is really significant, if you go back to 2009, we did the Stimulus Act first, and then we did climate. Those things are being seen as the same thing now. Now, granted, there was a recovery bill that was looking at COVID and the economy, but the actual Rebuilding Act is fully integrated with climate. It's not seen as a separate thing. The care economy is integrated with that. A racial equity component is integrated with that. Second, that was elite-driven, inside the Beltway think tank approach. It was heavily neoliberal in nature. I was proud to support it, but it's not the approach that I wanted us to take at the time. And the idea was if we just get more corporate folks on board, then maybe we can get the bill through. That's not the politics of this moment, as John Paul noted. This is about how can we make sure more working and middle class people see themselves as benefiting from this? How do we make sure communities of color see this as being essential to their future? And I think even on tactical things, if you think back to that period, it was when a complaint about ACORN would lead to Democrats throwing ACORN under the bus in the way that Maxine Waters, they attempted to throw under the bus yesterday. And Democrats are falling for that less and less than they would have in the past, in part because they know movements are out there ready to tear them up if they do something like throw a strong Black woman under the bus in the middle of a legislative fight like this. So we've seen many, many things change. And whereas before, you had someone like Joe Lieberman standing in the way from a deep blue seat because he was fundamentally corporatist in nature, that's very different than a Joe Manchin. As much as I may not agree with all of his politics, he's someone who seems to be trying to get to yes from a deep red state where he really does have a challenge politically. And I think the work that Working Families Party and Sunrise or others are doing to try to build and show there really is a coalition here that can benefit from all this. But the key to that is not by cutting a good idea in half, it's by actually taking that good idea and going as bold as possible. That when we water these things down, we don't win over more people, we just feed that cynicism. So I think at a moment that we've seen, a verdict yesterday that we don't yet know whether it's an outlier or an inflection point, but we know it wouldn't have been possible without the activism that rose up around it. We see right now an opportunity for one of the most transformative pieces of legislation, probably the most transformative of my lifetime, but it's nowhere past yet. And the question is whether or not we're going to see that through and whether it's going to take anything like the form that the people on this call have had the courage to envision.
All right, Rhiana.
So thanks. It's really an honor to be here. Apologize for noises in the background. Other people live in my house and I can't control them. So, I think, so the piece that we wrote was about a World War II economic style mobilization and what the executive branch needed to do. And since I started working on the Green New Deal, it was clear that economic mobilization was the right framework. But I think for us, it's different than it was during World War II. Climate crisis is different in nature, right? When you have a war, it's very visible, particularly in the case of World War II, there's rationing, right? It's affecting everyone. And it's sort of a very clear and present threat, and people have an understanding of the stakes. That's sort of common. That's not true with the climate crisis. It appears different people, depending on their amount of privilege, how much they see the ravages of the climate crisis up close, depending on their political background as well. They can think about the climate crisis differently. And that's always an issue when you are trying to sort of embrace an economic mobilization. If you are trying to get a country to mobilize on a thing, it's very difficult if everyone doesn't agree on if the thing is even a problem, right? If it's real, if it's happening. And I think the last 2 years, particularly COVID, I think really changed that. And it didn't change, I think, it didn't change what the climate crisis is or what is happening, but I think it was the first time in a lot of people's lives that they had the sense of like, even in these modern times, it is possible to have a crisis that will upend daily life, that will stop us in our tracks, and that, that we are all sort of engulfed in. And I think it's made it easier for people to grasp what can happen in the case of a climate crisis. Because people, I think for a lot of folks, this is like the crisis that defines what a crisis is for them. And I think that touch point has been really, really critical. And I will also say that discussions of how, and I think it was very clear, right, the ways that environmental injustice overlapped with COVID. There were discussions of factory farming and how that is connected to emissions and how that contributed to the pandemic, right? So I think also people started to get a bigger understanding of what the climate crisis can do. It's not just storms, it's not just floods, it's not just wildfires, right? It can actually create more disease. It can create things that we don't want to happen. And I think all of that has sort of changed the frame of reference and made sort of Green New Deal policy seem a lot less wild, and has also given people sort of a touch point for what they don't want to happen. And really, I think, put some fire under folks to try to prevent something like this from happening again, and to be prepared, because I think it's also, I mean, I wouldn't say for a lot of people of color, but still, I think living through the COVID pandemic under the Trump administration was also, I think it was a time so both sides have often talked about the ways that government fails, but I think we really lived through a real failure of government and saw what that means, and also how important government is, that you do need this entity that is ready and can respond to things in ways that we as individuals can't, that our cities can't, that our states can't. And I think all of that has made the idea of sort of robust federal action, or having a strong public sector across the board, but particularly at the federal level, more palatable in a lot of ways. And that's great. And I will say also, it's been, I mean, obviously it's like night and day between the Trump administration and the Biden-Harris administration, particularly on climate. And it's been incredible to see the Biden administration really hang their economic recovery on climate in lots of ways and have that baked in. And those were Green New Deal principles. And I will shout out a little, it's not an accident. We designed it as a recovery plan. Wasn't like it fell from the sky. But that was because we knew that even back in 2018, we knew that a recession was on its way, but we had no idea that it was going to be this massive downturn, which again makes public investment make a lot more sense, right? When companies were pulling back, when states and locals have to pull back because they're reliant on tax revenue, it was very clear during the downturn, this is when we needed the federal government to step up. They have resources, they can do things. that other people can't. And so I think all of that has made Green New Deal policy and the type of sort of economic mobilization focused on equitable decarbonization and environmental justice more palatable and likely and popular. I will say though that there are still things in the way, right? The Green New Deal is about decarbonizing. It is about creating tens of millions of jobs, but it's also about changing the power relationships in our country, economically, politically, and socially. And, you know, even the American Jobs Plan, there is still some neoliberalism in there, right? There's a commitment to spending 1% of GDP every year over 8 years, and that's not all on climate. That scale is too small, right? And it was known to be too small. And there's still a reliance on, we have to pay for this through taxes, and a real fear of deficit financing, right? That is standing in the way of the scale that we need. And, you know, they're still talking about a market-based transition to clean energy. What does that mean for power relationships, right? And even the 40% commitment to frontline communities, that is wonderful and great, but we have gone from talking about 40% of investments to 40% of the benefits of investment, which we don't really know what that means. And no other federal program is based on the benefits of investment. When we talk about highways, we talk about the percentage of money, right? And so why, when it comes to environmental justice, we are not talking about a spending mandate, we are talking about benefits of investment, right? And that is not the same. And also 40%, we're talking about 40% as a ceiling, not a floor, right? And all of that is part of, you know, those vestiges of neoliberalism. Things don't change overnight, that we still have to fight against, even in this historic moment. And at the same time, I think what became very clear to me was that one of the biggest threats to climate action has always been and is increasingly so white supremacy. Right? When the insurrection on the Capitol happened and the 78 million people who voted for Trump, that was in the context of a pandemic. That was in the context, weren't there like wildfire? Like something wild was happening with climate, and people said, that does not matter as much as my ability to remain dominant as a white person or to have access to the power that whiteness provides. And that base is still the Republican base, right? We're still in a place where a lot of folks, we are talking about investments, but we're not talking about winding down fossil fuels, which is a huge environmental justice issue. And every time we say that we have to figure out what happens with the workers first, that's true. Workers shouldn't have to pay for that transition. But what is assured every day that we delay is that somebody, Black, Brown, or Indigenous, is getting sick or dying. And so we are still in a place, even as we are trying to get better, where we are sort of borrowing other people's times and lives to buy us time to figure out a package that meets our sort of political moment and the constraints of our sort of political and policy imaginations. And I think we have to be very clear about that still, because those are things that are standing in the way of having a real Green New Deal, and not just the best version of it that we can get with this current political situation. Which I understand, but I just wanted to point that out because there still are gaps between what we're seeing and what the Green New Deal is advocating.
Well, you preempted my next 3 questions, which is great. Literally on,
You're welcome.
Oh, it's perfect. That's exactly what you want as a moderator. It makes my job easier. But what you just said really gets into I think some of the political strategy questions about not just the Green New Deal as set a proposal as a sort of framework for governance and policy, but as having a real theory of change about what it looks like to build a coalition to sustain itself. And I know, Maurice, your piece gets at this pretty directly and talks about thinking about the Green New Deal as a way to build multiracial majorities, to beat back white supremacy, the Republican Party, and build electoral power that can sustain this. So, I would be curious to hear, you've been doing this sort of cross movement work to try and make that happen, right? To build that coalition. And I'd be curious sort of what your lessons over the last year, have been in terms of what it looks like to build a coalition around, a Green New Deal and intersectional climate agenda that really is looking to, allow people to see themselves in climate policy, which has not, historically been the case. And yeah, would just be curious to hear your reflections and kind of where you think we are.
Sure. Great question. Well, I think, pretty early on, we understood that we needed to develop a united front in order to make any of this possible. And as united fronts go, the two qualities that I think are the most important are the composition of the united front, who's a part of it, and who leads that united front, right? So it's not simply about bringing together a diverse potpourri of forces, right? Because I think we've seen in the past, and this is especially true for people in the climate justice movement, where folks have been part of broad coalitions, but have been marginal in those coalitions. And in any coalition, in order to align around principles, and in order to align around particular red lines and guidelines of struggle, you need to lean into some level of compromise, right? But I think the experience was that when it came to Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, people that are really at the margins and people who are feeling the downside, that the compromise always went in one direction, right? So people weren't interested, I think, in replicating that as it pertained to this opportunity. And so we had an opportunity to bring together a united front where the leadership actually represented the people on the ground, and that the people who had the most at risk were truly in a power position in the coalition. And in order to do that, like I always say that organizing, there's no shortcuts. So we took enough time to bring together the forces in labor, in mass movements, in climate, in grassroots organizing, to really sit down and to prefigure all the ways that the coalition would come undone, and if it relates to issues around race, or issues around how far are we ultimately going to go as it relates to issues of policy, from the lines we're going to draw around leaning into demand side versus supply side, and all of the rich contradictions within that, as it relates to how we're going to resource ourselves collectively, as it relates to the tensions between folks on the ground building movements in communities and national formations, and how to make sure we're in right relationship. We took the time to iron out all those things. Coalition organizing is really, really challenging, but we understood that pre-organizing was a prerequisite for us to be able to show up as a united front and show up in our power. And it's never easy, but I feel like what we've been able to do with the Green New Deal Network was demonstrate that it is possible to have a multiracial coalition that includes forces from different sectors, that includes forces that agree with each other on a number of things, but disagree with each other on some things, and find a way that folks could collaborate on not a lowest common denominator sort of collaboration where we're just doing the most basic things that we could agree on, but really push ourselves to do the things that are necessary. And I think implicit in the theory of the need for a united front is we need to aggregate enough power to win, which means we need all of us, which also means all of us need to be reflected in the policy. And when it comes down a time to push, we can't throw any of our interest under the bus, right? We actually have to do the hard work of pushing for not again, as it relates to the policy, the lowest common denominator, but actually pushing for what's necessary. And I think one of the things as it relates to this issue that keeps us there is our clarity around the science, around and around the stakes, right? Like this isn't abstract for a lot of people. It isn't abstract for me and my family. Like I was a climate refugee during Superstorm Sandy. This isn't some future that we're trying to avoid. This is the present for a lot of working class Black and brown people. And simply like there's no participation prize. Simply, going big in air quotes, but not going big enough will not agree with the science here. We actually have to go big enough in order to transition the world economy and the US economy from an extractive fossil fuel-based economy to one that's regenerative. And we need to do it with haste because we've been behind the curve. And I think that intensity of both the moral implications of the actual people that it hurts, and the fact that we have a coalition that is a coalition that is based, like all of the members of our coalition actually have real members. The science and the urgency of the political moment, I think all those three things keep us around the table, keep us wrestling with the contradictions, and finding an opportunity to get to yes with each other, not on the lowest common denominator, but what is necessary.
Thanks so much. I'm going to move on to John Paul, and it's been I mentioned this in the beginning, but a pretty dizzying week in terms of climate policy. I mean, it's Wednesday now, and the Green New Deal for Cities bill has been introduced, Green New Deal for public housing, Civilian Climate Corps, the reintroduction of the Green New Deal resolution. And that's just so far. There's more coming, as I understand. So I'm wondering if you could, give us a little snapshot for what's happening this week as part one of this question. And part two, I'd be curious, Sunrise was founded in the Trump administration when, what y'all were doing was very much on the outside of politics. But we're in a very different political moment. There is a Democratic Congress and a Democratic White House that is, interested in sort of reaching out to progressive groups, has, been on the phone with movement leaders. So I'd be curious, thinking about how to get the Green New Deal sort of over the finish line, get it into, a proposal. How are folks in Sunrise thinking about this kind of inside-outside strategy that's been, such a core part of Sunrise's DNA, and is now sort of existing in this very different moment than when y'all started out.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a question that we're continuing to answer by the day as things shift so incredibly fast. But yesterday was definitely a big day. Yesterday, Ed Markey and Rep. AOC, along with a new cohort of congressional co-sponsors, reintroduced the Green New Deal. But maybe that's the legislative word for it. But in its true essence, the Green New Deal never left. The movement for a Green New Deal only grew, I think, with the onset of the pandemic and the crisis becoming more apparent to loads of people. And our movement has been operating in several ways around this. Like you said, we have an inside-outside strategy in our DNA. And I think that has been really effective in taking the movement from a place of shifting what's politically possible by galvanizing public support to one that also is functioning within the halls, like a movement that has entered the halls of power by, having not only congressional allies who were taking the Green New Deal from this vision to a priority in Congress like 2 years ago, but for our OG talking points to be parroted by Joe Biden at a debate. Like what happened there? Big shift. So There's a lot ahead of us, and there's lots of things that we're excited about right now. So as we know, yesterday the Green New Deal was reintroduced, but another really exciting thing that was introduced was the Civilian Climate Corps, right? And that's a big deal for us. We're in the height of a campaign called Good Jobs for All, where we are posing a stark decision in the eyes of decision makers, right? Are you going to invest in the communities that you represent by ushering in bold plans, not only to solve the climate crisis, but also to provide good jobs for people? Or are you going to side with corporations who have run our planet and our economy in such unjust ways and keep people struggling and jobless? The decision is pretty clear, and it's a very polarizing one, and one that should be easy to make for people who truly do represent their constituents. So we're looking back at history in this moment, right? We're looking back at a familiar time of crisis back in the era of the New Deal, and we are reminiscent of the Civilian Conservation Corps at the time. And it's interesting to see that even at that time, Roosevelt's original CCC, because I don't want to say Civilian Corps or Conservation Corps every time, his original CCC employed around 300,000 young Americans at a time when the US population was about 40% of what it was today. Biden's CCC, the one that we pressed him to include as part of the Biden Unity Task Force that Varsh, who isn't here today, but I'm filling in for, really fought for, he actually took that up. But what did he include? What did he want to invest? 10 billion over a decade. That's not what we need. That is not what we need. I mean, Kate, you said it yourself really well in a tweet with like a reference to Zoolander, but like, yeah, what is this? A CCT for ants, right? This is only going to create about 10 to 20,000 jobs over the course of the decade, when we know that the scopes are really much more ambitious. So yesterday, Senator Ed Markey rolled out a proposal for the Civilian Climate Corps that could employ about 1.5 million Americans over the scope of the next 5 years. And our movement is fighting to make sure that that is included in the infrastructure package, right? Let's redefine the scopes and scale and definition of what infrastructure really means. But going back to the original question, sorry, just nerding out about CCC just because it's really exciting. I think it's worth noting the fact that our movement has had to grow a lot with the opportunities that have been sort of launched at us within these past 2 years. And it's been a really hard thing to do, especially when, we set off thinking about this inside-outside strategy, knowing that the only way we would get an authentic inside strategy with a lot of integrity was by having a popular movement. So we've been doing the work of creating a popular movement for, the 2 to 4 years that we've been around, and it exploded in size. And we had to develop leaders and develop plans and develop strategies that could keep pace with the scope at which we were growing. And so by seizing those opportunities, I think that we've been able to shift the window of what's possible. Nonetheless, there's a big opportunity to ask for more and more, not just to be the agitators in the room, but to actually ask for what it is that we need and what we deserve, right? Like Tom said, it's not about watering down an idea to access what's politically possible, but to access an idea that people deserve and need right now. So yeah, we've been working hard making sure that Sunrise isn't only thought of as this group of young people that are the agitators in a room, but are ready to swing for the fence if movement leaders and people in Congress are ready to swing for the fence with us. So in the scopes of the next 5 years, and I think in the scopes of this administration, we're really asking ourselves the tough questions of what constituencies do we need to mobilize in order to win a Green New Deal at the scale necessary, and who are the folks necessary to get us there, and what key places around the United States do we need to deeply invest leadership in order to create our or get our governing vision from a vision into an actual reality. So definitely big questions there. And there's an entire process in Sunrise Movement right now where a cohort of leaders are thinking about those things. And I'm lucky enough to be part of that group. And will say that just the weight and the speed of the moment is something that is really weighing down on us, but something that we're ready to meet and ask tough questions about every day.
Yeah, well, on the topic of tough questions, Tom, your piece from a year and change ago looked at legislative strategy for getting a Green New Deal and many other things. You lay out an American Dream for All Act, including both climate and antitrust enforcement, immigration reform, the racial wealth gap, obesity, childcare, and as being an omnibus package, right? And so we're now in the situation where we're seeing a lot of things put into an omnibus package that maybe pass through reconciliation. Not a small chance, right, that a lot of the things we've been talking about show up in an infrastructure package. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about your sort of reflections on that a year on, and how the American Dream for All Act that you lay out, how you see that sort of, is that what we're looking at right now? Or, what are the gaps in the Biden plan? And, are you, is this kind of what what's on the table?
I mean, it's mostly a shockingly happy story in the sense that I think we're seeing a White House be much bolder than we expected from any Democrat, and perhaps particularly around the Biden administration, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. The overall use of reconciliation and omnibus bills is obviously, dominating the process, and I think that's progress. I still think back to the idea of taking a good idea and cutting it in half doesn't make it better, that had we done all of this in a single omnibus in the first 100 days, it still would have probably had about the same, political process we would have gotten it through with more time. It's easy for me to say that from the cheap seats. And in the same way that I think splitting it in two creates a more difficult political process, I think the fear that they're going to now cut this omnibus in two as well and do the hard infrastructure in one is not the way I would go. But I neither ran for president nor managed to get elected president, and have respect for the fact that they have come into office at a time that was a contested election, an attempted coup, having to win, 2 seats in Georgia, having a pandemic, having an economic recession, and, very, very thin, the thinnest of margins in both the House and the Senate. And we focus a lot on the Senate, but we have to remember, if you go back, we had significant majorities in the House in the 09-10 period, and we still only got healthcare across, and that was a watered down healthcare by 2 votes, and climate change by 2 votes, with whatever was 40-seat majorities at the time. Now we have a lot more movement strength. We've moved Overton windows, all that sort of stuff. But the fact is, it's a tough political landscape. That being said, I do hope they keep these pieces together. There was encouraging news yesterday that the White House signaled willingness to use reconciliation for at least some of the immigration reforms. And our immigrant brothers and sisters and those advocating, as many on this call do, have a very rational sense that they are going to get thrown under the bus. And this goes partly to Maurice's point about why we need to stop seeing these issues as separate. The crisis on the southern border is absolutely impacting legislation on immigration, and that border crisis is absolutely created and amplified by climate change, and has been now for a number of years. It's not the only driver, but it's a significant driver of that. And understanding how we need to treat and address these issues together is important. I think probably most of us on this call would support getting rid of the filibuster, but at a minimum reforming it to allow for not just budget, but core democracy functions to go through at 50. And that's the other set of legislation which again probably won't be an omnibus, even if we reform the filibuster, but could be a package with, you know, HR 1, HR 4, DC statehood, Puerto Rican self-determination, the PRO Act, and you know, potentially the Equality Act qualifying under that reform as well. So, you know, I think the overall sense among Democrats that is, it's not a consensus view, but a dominant view, even among some of the establishment leaders, is that good policy is good politics right now. That delivering big results early and making sure we tell the story of those results is crucial. And the window of time is not that large. If we go back to the 2010 election, you know, people focus on the healthcare fights and the nasty town hall meetings and the rest. But if you look at the Virginia election in 2009, which is usually a harbinger of the midterms, the Democrats got wiped out by 20 points in 2009, a year before the 2010 election. In other words, the narrative had already set in. Were Democrats fighting for, you know, everyday folks? Obviously, it was racialized with the president and with, you know, Limbaugh's comments about healthcare being reparations for Black people and the rest. So we can dig into all of that, but I think the overall impulse we were pushing with the omnibus idea was go big early. Don't go with this 90s incremental approach or treat Wall Street reform over here and healthcare reform over here and stimulus over here and, you know, living wage over there. We need a vision, a more comprehensive vision, like these brilliant people have laid out, whether you call that rebuilding a new, more inclusive American dream or economy or whatever you want to call it, Green New Deal. The reality is these things are interconnected. People don't want to just get back to pre-COVID. They want to get, things haven't been good for a generation, as Elizabeth Warren lays out better than just about anyone. And so I think as long as we're swinging for the fences with bold reforms early that have enough time for people to be able to feel the results of those, and as Maurice said, we continue to have trust across movements so that we're not setting one issue group against another, because frankly, we don't have enough power. We barely have enough power if everyone's rowing in the same direction to push this thing. So in that sense, again, I do want to say with everything that this administration's been up against, I think overall their instincts have been to go bolder, go earlier, to go with whatever gets the legislation through rather than the civility stuff. But they obviously have some strong impulses back in the other direction to sort of give Republicans a chance, et cetera, that, you know, maybe a little more than some of us would advise, but, you know, they're the ones who have to answer for it.
Yeah, I want to come back to Rhiana. You know, I think you pretty well debunked the "is neoliberalism dead?" question at the start. But you know, it seems like it's not. You know, and we're not done with it. I'm wondering. You know, there does seem to be a difference in the way that people are talking about climate policy in particular in the last 10 years, right? As we described at the start of the call, and in particular, you know, there is a focus on spending. It's not, you know, as sort of focused on you know, a program like cap and trade as the centerpiece of the policy. And I'm wondering, you know, I think, you know, the work that you did and that the Green New Deal has done, organizers to sort of push forward a more holistic vision of climate policy has been a big part of that. And I wonder if, you know, from the policy folks that you talk to, do you think there's a sort of recognition of like treating policy as a way to build the case for more policy and better policy? And to clarify, maybe, you know, do you get the sense that people are thinking about the way policy is designed as something which can build support for electoral majorities for Democrats, or is it a little bit more narrow in that? And, you know, I'd be curious too, just like what, you know, to say a bit more about the work that you've done, you know, sort of making clear that, you know, the sort of narrowest market-based tweaks won't get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I do think in lots of ways people are starting to see policy as a way to communicate that is not so different than the other ways that you communicate politically. It's not that different from speeches, it's not that different from visiting communities, is an extension of that. I mean, and I think that you've seen people experiment with it at different levels. So, I mean, I think Elizabeth Warren basically built a whole campaign around that idea of policy being a way that you communicate and an extension of your values, and policy design being important to reaching out to different types of communities. I think you've seen some folks try it at the state level. And I do think that in 2020, in that election, we did have more discussions about policy in a way that like I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime. And so I think that that is happening. And I think that it is like an emergent worldview. I mean, I remember when I worked on a state campaign in 2018, I mean, we wrote a lot of policy, and we thought that it's actually a really important way to reach out to like communities of color, communities that are often left out, because when you go and ask them for their vote, they want to know how. They've had people blowing smoke, excuse my French, blowing smoke up their asses for generations, right? And so coming in and being like, I want to do X, people had follow-up questions. Well, how are you going to do X? And it was a way to communicate that, also a deeper knowledge of them. We see you in a way that maybe other people don't see you, because we're talking about things like foreclosure, right? Which is something like Elizabeth Warren coming out with Black maternal health. Like, that is a way of saying, I see you as a demographic, I see you as a community, and I'm actually really thinking intimately about your struggles. But that is not necessarily what like the consultant class, right, that works with these campaigns thinks, right? There's still an idea, I think, particularly in campaigns, that you keep it broad, you keep it moving. Voters aren't that smart. And I think that that we're seeing that people are much smarter than we've given them credit for, and that they're not children that just want to see like nice videos, but they are adults who are trying to figure out how to make a way in a country that is, I think for a lot of folks, increasingly difficult. And so I do think that that acknowledgement of policy and the ways that it's important is evolving. I will say that I think particularly in DC, there is still a relatively shallow understanding of policy design, in the sense that often policy is still written to be passed, but we're not thinking deeply about how it will be implemented on the state or local levels, right? What about questions of administrative burden? We aren't thinking about, say, like even with the infrastructure package, how will local entities sort of move out those vast amounts of money in a way that actually includes community participation, right? We generally stop at the sort of, we give the money to states or we give the money to localities, and policy design is, particularly if you're trying to have equitable outcomes, is more complex than that, right? Requires us to think about democratic control in ways that we haven't in a very long time. And so I think that that is coming to the fore, and that this administration is more interested in that. But again, I think that is evolving. And I think the 40% benefits versus investment is a really good example of that. I've had plenty of conversations where I'm pretty sure the folks who were talking about it didn't really know the difference, right? They picked up the language from New York, where that demand came from, that they're modeling it off of, and they didn't necessarily know the fight that had been watered down from investments, that community, that advocates have fought against that might have been a move by Governor Cuomo, and it looked very much like a move by Governor Cuomo to sort of water down that commitment. But they're just, modeling it off, and so they think it's the same thing, and it's not, right? And so that is that's what I mean. And that just has so much to do with the way that offices aren't funded well, right? Congressional offices have small budgets, right? Things move very fast. There's not really a lot of support. So it has everything to do with that. But yeah, so I think it's evolving, but there's still a ways to go. And I think there's still, I think, a real big gap, particularly now that we're talking about wanting to move forward environmental justice, wanting to make sure that these investments turn into new opportunities for ownership and wealth and power, that requires a real sort of deep understanding and collaboration with folks working on the local level and not just in local government, to understand how these grants, how these programs actually hit on the ground. And whether the money is going to communities or whether it's going to like suburban contractors who have the staff to fill out the paperwork. So I think that is, it's an ongoing struggle, but that is just because that's not the type of policy making we have done for a long time. And it's not incentivized still in the systems that we have. I think I answered your question, but I might have forgotten. There's a lot of people walking around in this room.
No, you definitely answered that. And I was wondering, Maurice, if you maybe want to talk about New York a bit and kind of where the 40% comes from, and if you have any sort of context on that. My understanding is there, you might, but if I'm wrong on that, can move on.
I'm not much for granular context and on the New York fight, but what I will say is that the only thing I will add is that in any of these fights in a particular state, what we're able to secure is based on the dynamics. And what Rhiana shared is right. Like, not much passed through New York without the blessing of Governor Cuomo. And so it's hard to understand policy without understanding the unique political dynamics in New York. There's probably more that could be said, but I'll just leave it at that. And I think it's actually, I think Rhiana makes a good point, right? Like, we secure victories. Embedded in those victories are particular compromises. Our language isn't random. Like the language of particular pieces of legislation, embedded in it are particular fights, particular red lines, particular choices. That detail gets lost, right? And we just have a snapshot, and then the language or the policy becomes a particular idea, then people then move without excavating sort of that story to understand what we're saying when we're saying a particular thing. And it becomes really, really important, especially when you're then taking a lesson and then federalizing it. So, to Rhiana's point, the details matter.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Tom, as a former House member, I've been surprised in reporting just, how quickly things move in the House and how little information people are operating with at any given time. I'm wondering if you could just give us a little window into, as a member, how is it that the policies sort of come to people's desk? And how contingent is that process on whether you have a staffer who is knowledgeable about this thing, or what is the sort of information a representative kind of needs in order to have a solid footing on a given policy issue?
Well, the really scary thing is how policy comes together in state legislatures, where people have almost no staff. There is no congressional budget office to score things. Often you have legislators making $17,000 a year with maybe one staffer during session. And meanwhile, the corporations have entire teams of lobbyists who write the legislation, create the spin, do the analysis. And to stick with that for a second, if you look at how dramatically things have changed in Virginia in the last couple of years, it's not just because Democrats took over, it's because a different set of Democrats took over. It was a new generation, it was more diverse, it was more women of color, it was more people from working class backgrounds who were able to look at some of these bills that got handed around even by Democrats and say, that's not my lived experience. So one thing is having people in the room with different lived experiences, having people who are there and know why they're there. And it's not just because they were a good looking white guy who went to the local law school and can raise money, but because, they've had experiences in their community that they want to change. So if you take that to Congress, the good news is you do get a staff and you get a congressional budget office that can score things, et cetera. But at the same time, you will often have things move very quickly. You'll have a lot of votes that are, fairly symbolic votes. And then you make the mistake of thinking one is symbolic when it's not. But this, I think, is also where the movement groups come in. I mean, one of the things that the folks on this call have done so much of in the last 2 years is building trust with each other and across movements, because there's so much history of every single part of the progressive coalition getting sold out. Obviously, communities of color in particular, Black communities in particular, Black women in particular, but every different part of the coalition. And what comes up in situations like this is ultimately going to be something where everyone's looking for trust transference is a good thing, which is there are progressive groups that care what Sunrise and working families and others think. And they're going to say, is this good enough? And I think one of the challenges we have is because the party has so often sold out, many of us start from an assumption that no, whatever they're agreeing to has to be less than what we can get. But the reality is there is a point at which that's no longer true. And people are going to be looking to movement leaders to say, you know what, this isn't everything we wanted, but this is the bill we want to throw down on. And those calculations are all about subjective judgment and trust. And part of it is about information. And sometimes it's like, did you literally have time to read the bill? But it's also about predictability of things that you can't know. Or in our case, when we had the ACA going through, we had the public option in the version that left the House. We had the negotiated drug rates, but we also had the Stupak Amendment, which was supposed to be killed in the Senate because that's where the choice movement spent most of its money. And then it didn't get killed there and comes back. So you make a lot of judgments as you go about, things with incomplete information. So I think, what we know here is we have this is part of what the next 4 or 5 weeks are about. The committees are going to do hearings on this. The bill has not actually been written, as far as I know. There are sort of benchmarks that are written. And I think it's a team effort, and this is why it's great that the Progressive Caucus has become a much more serious force in the House, is that's a group of people that combined have a staff that can be following the intricacies, because sometimes a few words changed in a bill can have significant implications for this. So it's a tough process. And, one of the things that we got to give Speaker Pelosi a lot of credit for is she very rarely loses a vote. And she finds a way to get the bills out of the House typically. It's going to be important for the groups to follow it. It's going to be important for the groups to make decisions at certain points, because you can only really threaten to walk once in a negotiation in a way. Everyone on this call has had to make those judgments at times to do so. But the fact is, I think there are a lot of members up there that want to do the right thing, and a lot of staffers that want to do the right thing. And I think, that's why, as we said at the outset, almost everything had to go perfectly to be in a position that we're in, and 1,000 things could have gone wrong. So the fact that we're still in this, meaning have a chance for historic transformative legislation across a variety of issues, is a testament, I think, to everyone playing their part. And the next 3 months or less is going to decide whether that adds up to complete transformative victory. It would never be complete, but to transformative victory, to incremental victory, or to defeat.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that process, which you brought up, I mean, Virginia, it seems like Dominion is like the big state level like octopus,
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, that's true to a certain extent.
Well, and what you've got to remember about Dominion, just to come in.
Dominion Energy, the utility, just for folks who.
Which is the largest contributor to both political parties in the state. They don't show up with a bag of cash and they say, please do evil, right? They come to you and they say, here's how many African Americans we employ in your district. This is how we've rebuilt the community. They do a very skewed version that makes the rate sound good and other things. And if you don't have your own army of economists and lawyers to push back, you're like, well, that sounds like they're doing a pretty good job. And it wasn't until Clean Virginia and Activate, a number of others really tore back those numbers and showed that actually it was one of the most regressive in the country, one of the most corrupt, that gives the legislators the cover to do it. So yeah, it's tough.
And this is maybe and before maybe getting to one or two questions, if I could ask, Rhiana, John Paul, Maurice, how you think about going up against that from sort of different spheres, just the sheer amount of lobbying power and PR muscle that the fossil fuel industry has, right? I mean, they are going to fight any kind of climate policy tooth and nail, and they have a lot more resources than progressive movements tend to have. So, I'm wondering for each of you, what tools as organizers and coalition builders and policy experts are helpful, in going up against what can seem like the sort of unfathomable power of Koch Industries or ExxonMobil as we're fighting for a Green New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, we're never gonna be able to keep up with them dollar for dollar. It's organized capital. They're called organized capital for a reason. They have all the capital, right? But the countervailing force that balances out organized capital is organized people, right? And in that respect, we have an almost unlimited resource as it relates to organized people. And the other advantage that we have is that, just to take a page from the first part of our conversation, what everybody on the planet experienced, the full collapse of all of our systems, our public health system, our economic systems, making bare all the contradictions in our society in America, from racial justice and anti-Black racism to the actual real present danger of white Christian identity movements as it related to, in its most violent manifestations in January 6th and some of the white supremacist killings, the wildfires, the extreme weather events that have taken place over the past year. These aren't abstract ideas. These are ideas that people are experiencing in their lives. And so the fossil fuel industry has money, but what they have to do is convince people, everyday people, not to believe their eyes and ears, right? And so I actually feel that what we have is reality on our side. Like, reality has caught up to the policy and politics prescriptions that folks have been saying for years. Like, it's no longer a both sides debate, I think, on the mass level, right? On the mass level, people understand at the core that we need to do really big things, that we're experiencing huge crises, that climate change is real. So one of the reasons why majorities of people supported, for example, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, even though if you watch cable news, right, there seem to be both equal sides, the like COVID is real side and wear a mask and we need to defeat this side, and the batshit crazy side that doesn't necessarily accept that COVID is real, right? Like on cable news, those were like two equal sides. On the ground, where more than 500,000 people have died, COVID is real, which is one of the reasons why massive investments was wildly popular with independents, Democrats, and a lot of Republicans. I think the same is true as it relates to how the downside of not addressing climate change is actually showing up in people's lives. So I think we have this great opportunity to do real mass organizing on a mass level, movement building on a mass level, and using all of our tools from, you know, the sort of traditional on the ground tools of you know, hitting people's doors and engaging in those deep conversations, to narrative tools to be able to speak to millions of people. And we don't have to convince folks. We simply have to key into what people are actually experiencing. And so that's what gives me hope that we will win. There will be a war, right? These industries will spend millions of dollars and attempt to block all change. One of the indications that I think is very telling is that, you know, these industries read the tea leaves, so they want to get ahead of things. So they're now beginning to concede points that we've been arguing, right? And they're beginning to kind of figure out how to greenwash what they see as motion towards the change that we've all manifested. To me, that's an indicator that we're winning and they're behind and trying to get ahead. It's important for us to like hasten. And I think at times when we shift the balance and folks in the corporate sector or folks that we've been opposed to politically begin to show some inclination that things are moving in the direction, there'll be those of us that will attempt to compromise too early, simply because corporations are offering some concessions. And I think the concessions just demonstrate the fact that we're winning. I think one of the things like I appreciated from Elizabeth Warren, she's like, when she said, I think somewhere publicly, that when corporations and the corporate class begin to scream bloody murder, many folks, including Democrats, they stop. But actually, that's just an indication that we go harder and that they scream harder, right? And I think it's a recognition that in a whose side are you on sort of battle, that our side has to be the side of the people, and that corporations providing concessions in the same way is sort of how any opponent attempts to provide concessions. It's in the interest of keeping things the same. And so I would just argue that we're in a moment where we have momentum on our side, and we're going to begin to see these corporate actors use language that have been developed on the ground, but that is an indication that we're winning, not because they're agreeing with us, but because they're trying to settle on a position where they continue to have a controlling position, but we have to continue to move.
Yeah, I think I found a lot of resonance with that. And I think that this question of like, how does a movement confront the amount of resources and power that are entrenched against us really bears like an answer that's both grounded in like a moral clarity and a moral reality, but it's also for like organizing our movements a question of infrastructure and good strategy. And it's, I think, a deep question of like, there are so many of us who want to win, but not all of us necessarily have the same path to get there. And, you know, like I'm thinking of like how I was just like praying and hoping that I wouldn't get some of the questions that you asked some of these other people. And I'm like, what are my strengths as a movement builder? Like where could I chime in well? And I think that's the question that lies before us, right? I think there's loads of folks who are, you know, working on policy angles that are hyper aware of making sure that the language and specificity of the vision that or that's included in the policy is guided by like strong guardrails that through communications with movements won't be compromised on, right? There's great value in that. And from that, you are able to communicate with movements and decide, what are we fighting for? Is this the right thing? Are they like subverting the movement? Are we compromising for less, and so on? And then the part about good strategy, I think is when we're dealing with an issue at this level that is existential, that is so overbearing, we only have so much capacity for what we have to do, for what we can do, right? So I think there's a clear question of responsibility that we must ask ourselves in our different organizations and movements, which is like, having a good strategy doesn't mean having an exhaustive list of things that need to change. It's about the realization of the power that we hold as a movement or an organization and how to leverage our people, our capacity, our power to build up or demolish certain pillars that we're going for. And the other point that Maurice brought up was like, that we are fighting from a place of reality, right? We're not coming into this fight from a place of like, oh, I want to help. No, it comes from a place of having intentional conversations and relationship building in which we're able to talk to our neighbors, friends, and loved ones and find a shared struggle and a principled struggle by which we can fight for. And that's very different to what the other side is fighting for, right? All of these corporate actors and those who are trying to stall progress are chasing money. What we have the opportunity to chase is a moral clarity, a responsibility, and a clinging on to the livelihood that we've always known. And one of those things is much more resonant with the entire population than the other. And I think that's the big silver lining that movements actually have and that good movements are born from. So when I'm thinking about it from Sunrise's perspective, one big question that we're asking ourselves now is, how much are we going to go forward with cultivating a mass movement that can change public opinion and shift the window of what's possible? And how much do we want to cultivate a movement that is more structure-based and is focusing on leveraging intense support in different states, communities, and so on in order to win a Green New Deal? But I think those questions are the right ones, not how do we win the whole thing, but how do we make sure that we're exerting our power as a movement in changing the dominant pillars of what we need to win, opening the path or the road on what we need to win. So yeah, just to sort of summarize my answer, I think there's a reality that social movements retain in speaking truth about when we have a social problem, especially as big as this one. What we're going to need is social movements to combat it, not individual actions here and there that we can all take. And then beyond that, what does it mean to weaponize the platforms and systems that we have right now, in which all of these consultants and politicos and operatives use to further their cause, that we can, build off of with our people to create a united front that leverages a very polarized army of people with moral clarity to confront the issue at hand. And when I look at the scope of different people who are here on the call, that's what I see, right? Like, I am so super committed to, like, not that y'all don't do this, I'm sure we all do it, and which is why we're doing this work, but like, I'm hella committed to talking to my neighbors, canvassing, knocking on doors, doing one-on-ones, building strong community and a movement. And I can't do that without folks who are also giving direction to our movement on what it is that we have to chase, what are the asks that we have to make, who are the people we need to target, and so on. So I think that the sort of overlooming opposition that we've been in for the past couple years has united a front of people who have a shared vision to achieve something. And we can't lose sight of that vision in the current political moment that we're in right now by being overly optimistic. So that answer was all over the place, as have been all of my previous answers. But I think these are still questions that I'm going to be chewing on and that I would love to talk to other panelists here about after this call or panel.
Yeah, so I'm not a canvasser. I'm very committed to donating. I'm very committed to data entry. I'm very committed to dropping off snacks.
Those keep us going too. Those keep us going too.
Talking to strangers.
We'll drop an address in the chat line for the snacks.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm not, canvassing that was like the one, it's my nightmare. Have done it 0 out of 10.
We all have different ministries.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll write you the report. I will say from our end, so the Roosevelt Institute is an economic think tank. And I mean, the Green New Deal in lots of ways is about thinking about the climate crisis as an issue on a number of levels, but as an economic issue. And so our approach and the approach of my work right now to the fossil fuel industry is really talking about the gigantic risks that it poses to our economy if left, and to workers and to the communities most dependent on those industries if left unabated. And so one of the things that actually we'll be putting out a paper on from our fellow David R. Cush is about an argument where we actually are trying to flip, because really the ways that a lot of folks think about it is that fossil fuels are embedded in our economy, and thinking particularly about sort of financial policy, that fossil fuels are embedded in our economy and that we talk about climate change as financial risk. But risk sort of implies that it could or could not happen. It might come, it might not. And so one of the things that that paper argues and that our program argues is that climate risk is not a risk, it's a guaranteed harm. Whether you're talking about physical risks, which is sort of storms, wildfires, or you're talking about transition risk, which is the sort of the risks that come along with moving from fossil fuels to clean energy. So we're arguing that both of those things are connected. The more physical risks you have, the more transition risk you actually create, because as climate change gets worse, it's going to become more urgent to move off of fossil fuels. So essentially, we're trying to flip and say that climate change is a guaranteed harm, but what the actual risk to our economy is fossil fuels, is the fossil fuel industry. And also, along with that, pushing, which is not just a narrative, it's just really straight facts, which is that we have the power already. Financial regulators at the federal level already have the power to do things that force disinvestment in fossil fuels and can be the first steps to a wind down. So Dodd-Frank allows macroprudential regulation, and it actually says that that regulators have a responsibility to step in front of a crisis as it's coming that's going to be very detrimental to our economy, and use these regulatory powers, whether that's sort of portfolio limits or activity limits, to push the financial system away from that thing. And that isn't something that I think regulators know, but they're sort of lax to, or they're slow to use that power without feeling like there is some sort of political mandate. So we're sort of also pushing an argument that it's actually the responsibility of regulators to act proactively, even if there isn't sort of legislation that allows for that to happen, because it is their responsibility as regulators who are looking after the health of the US economy and to some extent the global economy too. So that's the work that we're doing, that's largely trying to set out a path that both pushes regulators to be more proactive on fossil fuels and also lays out a suite of tools that we already have to say that that is possible. And we're also doing advocacy work on the Hill and increasingly with the admin to push all of those things, because, you know, financial regulators are now talking about climate risk. They're talking about climate change, but we're still largely focused on disclosure, which is just about having companies tell us how much damage they're doing, but disclosure doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do anything about what they are disclosing. And so just really pushing more action, and really just laying out, trying to start the foundation of an argument about the public sector actually needing to step in and likely facilitate a wind down of fossil fuels instead of assuming that companies will do it on their own or that the market will force it, much less force it in a way that protects workers and communities, and actually take seriously the issue of revenue, right? States, there are a number of states that are reliant on that tax revenue. That is likely going to be a place where the federal government is going to need to step in and help, you know, close those gaps. So just starting that conversation and just really starting to push a narrative of public intervention in fossil fuel wind down and the necessity of that. Yeah.
Well, that's my favorite personal note to end on. But thank you so much, everyone. Maurice, John Paul, Rhiana, Tom, all the folks at Democracy Journal and the Open Society for helping put, you know, this event together and the issue. Yeah, this has been a really great conversation. Thanks y'all for making the time and for everyone who came.
It was great being
Thank
here.
you. Happy Earth Day.
Thanks, y'all.
Oh yeah.
Bye.
Well.